Rome, at its peak, was the greatest power of the ancient world. From Hispania to Syria, all roads led to Rome. The empire's stature was so grand that for thousands of years after its fall, nearly all Western nations justified themselves by claiming lineage to its legacy. Yet, before it became the historical hegemon we now know it as, it was a young republic wrestling with growing internal divisions. The very citizens who made up Rome's army and plowed its fields were drowning in debt, shut out of public office, and marginalized by arbitrary and unwritten laws. These citizens were the plebeians, non-aristocratic Romans who made up a vast majority of the city. The new republic that promised liberty was tearing itself apart over the question of equality. During this centuries-long national struggle known as the Conflict of the Orders, cycles of plebeian revolution, patrician reaction, and institutional reform transformed the Roman Republic, forcing Rome to renegotiate power, expand political offices, and gradually limit elite control. These changes enshrined ideas that would later lay the foundations of modern political theory. But this outcome was not inevitable. In its earliest years, Rome faced deep inequality even before it had developed the institutions capable of resolving it.
Rome was formed in the 8th century by the merging and urbanization of local Italian tribes. The landholding and priestly families of the clans maintained their influence within the developing city and became the Patricians. Everyone else became the Plebeians. In 509 BC, the Res Publica Romana, the Roman Republic, was established. Romans viewed the Republic as a mixed government, balancing monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But in practice, the balance tilted towards the patricians, who cemented their control through debt bondage and exclusion of plebs from public and religious office. These policies were justified by the mos maiorum, ancient customs that functioned as law but were known only to the patricians. To them, it safeguarded order. To the plebs, it was domination by another name. Long before plebeians organized resistance, the patricians were already reacting to contain political equality before it could emerge. Ancient historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote the perspective of a pleb in his 11th book. For we are living apart from one another, as you see, and inhabit two cities, one of which is ruled by poverty and necessity, and the other by satiety and insolence. The question was not whether the plebeians would revolt, but whether Rome would survive.
During the early Republic, Rome was a near-constant war that required plebs as soldiers. When levied, plebs left their farms, forcing their families to take loans that used their freedom as collateral in a process called nexum. In 494 BC, war was looming again, and plebeian fury exploded. Roman tradition tells of a final straw. A nexum enslaved elderly veteran, scarred by both war and his master's whip, who collapsed into the forum. Whether real or symbolic, the veteran's story reflected plebeian outrage everywhere. Fearing riots, the Senate appointed Manius Valerius, a pro-reform patrician, to lead the army. But after victory, they rejected his dead plan, and in response, Valerius urged the plebs to abandon the city in the first Secessio Plebis, or secession of the plebs. As the plebs revolted and withdrew to the Sacred Mount, Rome's enemies re-advanced. The defenseless Senate sent Valerius to negotiate. He pleaded for the plebs' return, but Sicinius, the plebeian leader, refused. The plebs would not fight for a city that denied them its promises. The Senate finally yielded reform via the establishment of the Tribune of the Plebs and the Plebeian Assembly, offices that could propose legislation to defend the plebs. Tribunes were declared sacrosanct, shielding them from patrician retaliation. While still weak compared to the consuls in the Senate, the plebs had finally entered the Republic, and so rejoined the army. Rome was safe, and the plebs had begun a pattern. Plebeian revolution through withdrawal of indispensable labor. Patrician reaction through resistance and then capitulation. Reform through institutions. Refusing to use a sword was more powerful than wielding it.
Over the next generation, plebeian power expanded. In reaction, patricians weaponized the mos maiorum to reassert control. The tribunes responded by blocking abuses with their religious protections. Tension soared, and another secession loomed. To relieve the pressure, in 451 BC, Rome elected the decemvirate to codify Rome's laws. A council of 10, led by Appius Claudius, it was granted complete power to write the 12 tables of Roman law. Though it enshrined inequality, the law was finally known and now challengeable. But Appius did not step down. The patricians had launched their own revolution, not for reform, but to reverse it. The new 12 tables were suspended, and martial law was imposed. The plebs were outraged, and even conservative senators resented the coup. Then came the final breaking point. Roman tradition describes Appius becoming obsessed with Virginia, a young plebeian woman, and enslaving her. Her father, Virginius, then killed her, rather than let Appius take her. Then Virginius led the plebs to the Aventine Hill in the Second Secession. The Decemvirate collapsed after a single Senate vote. Revolutionary power without leverage is illegitimate. Rome needed the plebs' labor. It didn't need the Decemvir's tyranny. The Republic was restored and the 12 Tables reinstated. Appius was found dead in his cell before trial, and with his suicide died the possibility that Rome would ever be able to turn back the plebs' reform.
The plebs understood something crucial. Rome had now accepted them as a pillar, however resentfully. The tribunate, the veto, assemblies, they'd all become more powerful than secession alone. In 367, the plebs had mastered the pattern. Rome's latest conquests were distributed only to patricians and a few lucky soldiers instead of the plebs. But, in response, neither violence nor even secession was used by the plebs. Instead, they procedurally crippled the government for 5 years until the Senate gave in with the Licinius Sextius referendum. Debt and land relief were implemented, but, most importantly, eligibility to the office of consul was also expanded to the plebs. Lucius Sextius was elected the very next year as the first commoner to hold Rome's highest office. In 326, the story of a young man enslaved by Nexum, who was sexually abused, spread like wildfire across Rome. The pattern held, and from popular support alone, the Lex Patellia Papiria was passed. Nexum, the debt bondage that had sparked the conflict of the orders so many years ago, had been abolished. The patricians had learned the limits of reaction. They could resist reform, but they could no longer unilaterally control Rome. In 287, there was one final crisis. Surviving fragments of Livy's writing tell of heavy and long riots over debt, suggesting a grassroots revolutionary upheaval markedly different from the notably peaceful and organized resistance from the past. The plebs seceded again, this time to the Janiculum Hill. The Senate's reaction demonstrates the change the Roman system had undergone. Quintus Hortensius, a pleb, was appointed as dictator to resolve the emergency. The plebs had become so ingrained in the Roman system that Rome trusted one with absolute power to resolve its deepest divisions. So, Quintus passed the Lex Hortensia, creating legal equality. After centuries of civil struggle, the conflict of the orders was over. Not because Rome's discord magically disappeared, but because Rome learned to channel it. Revolution, reaction, and reform would no longer threaten Rome, because that cycle was built into its constitutional foundation.
It is essential to understand that the Romans were not objective record keepers of their own history. The most famous Roman historian of antiquity, Livy, makes fact and fable because the goal wasn't to merely document, it was to gain meaning of the present from the past. The surviving works about the conflict of the orders largely come from the late Republican and early Imperial period. In that span, Rome was racked by factional political turmoil between elite optimates and populus populares. As a result, contemporary writing on the conflict of the orders reflected their national anxieties by emphasizing both the class divide and hope the Republican framework can manage the crises. Some analysis of the conflict of the orders, like that of G.E.M. de Stokoe and Theodore Mommsen, look at the Roman emphasis on social class and conclude that the story was that of a class war of commoners fighting a system of institutional oppression. But this view may unintentionally miss how the plebeians actually viewed themselves and acted. The plebs never thought of themselves as outside the Roman system. To them, they were citizens who dedicated themselves to making Rome live up to its promises, and it would harness its institutions to ensure it would. Change occurred via leverage, not terror, and enforced through offices, not armies, because the plebeians did not revolt against the system. They revolted from within it. This pattern of withdrawal, pressure, and negotiation repeats throughout history. Machiavelli, in his discourses, argued Rome's political structure created by the conflict of the orders propelled its rise. The founding fathers explicitly modeled their checks and balances on Roman mixed government. And the method of plebeian progress also reemerges through history. Labor unions striking for contracts, the civil rights movement boycotting for legislation. Movements succeed not from chaos, but by leveraging their role within the system. The struggle of competing interests drives history, but how civilizations manage that struggle determines their fate. All societies revolt. All societies react. But the conflict of the orders reveals what makes reform succeed. The plebeians understood that successful revolution, societal revolution, comes from leverage, not violent or powerless dissent. The patricians recognized that an endless reaction would destroy Rome like countless others. Rome's progress demonstrates that the institutionalization of reform is what distinguishes republics from tyranny. In tyranny, conflict destroys. In a republic, conflict builds.